Donald Trump's chief negotiator, Steve Vitkov, has once again shocked everyone. It has become known that Vitkov suggested that Kyiv seek a 10-year exemption from trade tariffs from Donald Trump's administration instead of receiving Tomahawk cruise missile deliveries. Steve Vitkov convinced the Ukrainian side that a delay in tariffs would provide the country with a more significant economic boost, and that missiles would not help anyway against what he claims is a stronger Russia. As you remember, Steve Vitkov is convinced that Putin wants peace, and Vitkov admits that he has a great deal of respect for Putin. And at the same time, that same Steve Vitkov was conducting secret negotiations with the Russians, instructing Ushakov and Dmitriev on exactly how to negotiate with Trump in order to impose the Russian vision of ending the war in Ukraine on him. It was Vitkov, in particular, who persuaded Trump not to supply Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, assuring him that Russia had almost agreed to end the war. So, Donald, let's not escalate. Putin has almost agreed. And now, The Telegraph reports that Vitkov is heading to Moscow next week with a big gift from the United States, which essentially betrays Ukraine, since Trump has decided to unilaterally recognize Russian control over the occupied Ukrainian territories. My name is Alexei Pechiy. Let's discuss this topic together, but before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like this video, leave any comment under this episode, and subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechiy News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in. If you want to support the work of this YouTube channel, you can do so financially with any donation or a paid sponsorship subscription using the links and details in the description of this video. There are a variety of platforms there, so choose any form of support that's convenient for you. I would be grateful to you for that. So, the special envoy of the United States President, Steve Vitkov, suggested that Kyiv seek a 10-year exemption from trade tariffs from the Donald Trump administration instead of deliveries of Tomahawk cruise missiles. The Wall Street Journal reports this, citing informed sources. According to the publication, Steve Vitkov convinced the Ukrainian side that a postponement of trade tariffs would provide the state of Ukraine with a more significant economic incentive. In this context, Steve Vitkov stated, "What good can a handful of missiles do, like the removal of tariffs?" Now that's interesting. Vitkov himself neither confirmed nor denied this information, only stating that he is involved in making deals. Quote, "We keep knocking on the door and offering ideas." That's how he commented on the rumors that he was the one who disrupted the transfer of the Tomahawks. So Vitkov didn't even try to defend himself in response to being accused of disrupting the Tomahawk deal. And this isn't the first publication to write that Vitkov, as if, working for Russia, is disrupting Donald Trump's most crucial decision on Ukraine. Earlier, the Wall Street Journal reported that Vitkov actually disrupted the Tomahawk deliveries to Ukraine by giving advice to Putin's aide, Yuri Ushakov. So how should Putin build communication with Donald Trump? First of all, he says, you need to praise him for peace in the Middle East. According to data from the leaked recording of their conversation, it was the special envoy of the American president who suggested organizing a phone call between Trump and Putin. On the eve of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's visit to the White House, where they plan to discuss the transfer of Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. After the call with Putin, Trump refused the deliveries, citing a reduction in stockpiles. But in reality, the Russians convinced Donald Trump that it was not worth transferring Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine because the Kremlin was supposedly almost ready to end the war. With only a couple of issues left, escalation wasn't necessary. The Wall Street Journal noted at the time that Trump's opposition was influenced by Putin, who claimed that sending Tomahawks would lead to escalation. The Kremlin reported that Putin, in the conversation, quote, repeated his point that Tomahawks would not change the situation. Tomahawks would not change the situation on the battlefield, but the relations between our two countries will be damaged. Vitkov confirmed these points to Trump when Trump asked, so, are they really ready to end the war? And Vitkov was assuring Trump that yes, Putin is really ready to end the war. So why should we give missiles to Ukraine now? That would only escalate things. We've almost signed the deal already. Well, as you know, just a few days after that, Vitkov hosted Kirill Dmitriev at his home in Miami, and together they wrote that very same 28-point peace plan. In addition, Vitkov, in a conversation with Ushakov, suggested preparing a peace plan similar to the agreement on the Gaza Strip. He expressed confidence that Russia has always wanted an agreement on Ukraine. He also admitted that he has the deepest respect for Vladimir Putin. I have a separate episode on this topic, and I recommend you watch it on my YouTube channel, so if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and make sure to subscribe. According to Bloomberg, Kirill Dmitriev, the Russian president's special representative for economic cooperation, may have given Russia's terms for ending the war to Vitkov, who then presented them as Donald Trump's peace plan. The document, among other things, proposed that Ukraine give up its territories, refuse NATO membership, and reduce the size of its army. The Guardian, let me remind you, conducted a linguistic analysis of the plan's text and found that the document contains constructions typical of Russian official business style, including numerous passive structures. I did a separate episode on this topic. And after the publication about Vitkov's contacts with Russian representatives, some Republicans in Congress demanded his dismissal. In particular, Representative Don Bacon stated that Trump's special envoy is, quote, acting as if he's on the Russian payroll. The incident turned into a fiasco, tarnishing the United States' reputation. Here is his quote: "Would a Russian paid agent have done less than Steve Vitkov? He should be fired, and besides, let me remind you, for example, Congressman Ted Lieu even called Vitkov a traitor." Overall, Vitkov was accused of treason, that he entered into a criminal conspiracy with a geopolitical adversary against a geopolitical ally. But Trump said, yeah, it's no big deal. And today, The Telegraph writes that when Trump's special representative Steve Vitkov enters the Kremlin, he is usually greeted with smiles. In 5 trips to Moscow, Vitkov has done a lot to please the Russians. In particular, as reported by the media, he gave recommendations to the advisor on foreign policy to the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, Yuri Ushakov, on how to win the favor of the American president. Before that, there were praises for Putin and the delivery of gifts upon returning to Washington from Russia. Well, let me remind you, there was a portrait of Trump and... well, I don't know, you really have to have no self-respect for that. Let me remind you that Vitkov, after one of his trips to Moscow, brought back a mocking Medal of Honor for the family of a CIA employee whose son died fighting for Moscow. And next week, Steve Vitkov will return to Moscow with a gift from the United States of America, with a promise that Washington will recognize Russia's claims to the Ukrainian territories occupied by Russian forces. Although Kyiv and Europe will not follow this example, I want to emphasize that approval from the world's largest economy, the United States, will to some extent help solidify the gains of Putin's invasion. In other words, the United States will be playing along with Putin's occupation policy. Trade with the United States could continue, using the occupied ports and valuable ore, rare earth metals, those very resources extracted from the occupied Ukrainian territories, could be exported from the country using those same occupied ports. And now I'll quote The Telegraph. "This is a disgusting proposal, a betrayal of Ukraine and a blow to the international order, but it is almost certainly not so disgusting, treacherous, or destructive as to ensure the end of the war. Discussions in the Kremlin will focus on Donbass." On Thursday, November 27, Vladimir Putin emphasized that the war will continue until Ukraine withdraws its troops or is pushed out of the 20% of Donetsk region territories that are still controlled by Kyiv. Let me also remind you that the original 28-point peace plan jointly developed by Vitkov and Vladimir Putin's aide Kirill Dmitriev required Ukraine to surrender this territory. This demand was softened after a meeting between the United States and the Ukrainian delegation in Geneva, and the issue was left for future negotiations between Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And well, not knowing how the negotiations will end, Vitkov, who will be joined by Trump's son-in-law Jared Kushner, might hint to the Russians that United States recognition will apply to these territories if a final agreement is made. This would allow Putin to continue demanding territory from Ukraine, knowing that his efforts are supported by Washington. In return, Zelensky may be offered concessions, as Putin hinted by promising to return small portions of the occupied territories to the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia regions. But that's not certain. Rather, it's a question of them withdrawing from part of the Kharkiv region and from those areas where they are in the Sumy region. However, even such a proposal will probably not be enough for Russia to lay down its arms, and perhaps other incentive bonuses will be added. It's possible, but Vitkov may be in for a huge surprise here. He's so self-confident that, he befriended the Russians and he doesn't feel any guilt or remorse about being a traitor. And he thinks that everything is almost settled. I'll quote the Telegraph here. The Telegraph has operated there for 11 years. Under the current circumstances, it seems Vitkov has found himself on the Moscow merry-go-round again. Smiles are probably the best he can hope for. I'll put an ellipsis here. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to leave a like. And of course, don't forget to support the work of this channel with your donation. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.